Marcus Demere's hands were shaking as he emptied the trash. In Harvard University's most prestigious building, professors and students walked past him, continuing their conversations without missing a beat, as if he didn't exist. "This janitor has been here for years," Professor Catherine Williams whispered to her colleague. "I don't think he even speaks English." Marcus kept his head down and continued working. What they didn't know was this. The non-English-speaking janitor had memorized every security code in this building. He knew every camera angle. He had discovered every hidden passage, and in 7 minutes a 12-man terrorist cell was about to attack the campus. The university housing some of the world's brightest minds was about to witness the bloodiest attack in its history, or so they thought. Because Marcus Demere wasn't just a janitor. He was a former Special Forces operative whose identity had been buried so deep that even the Pentagon had forgotten he existed. And today, he was about to use 8 years of accumulated intelligence to save everyone. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of unsung heroes, please consider subscribing for more tales of those who protect from the shadows. 8 years of the same routine. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Marcus Demere entered through the service entrance of Blackstone Hall, Harvard's crown jewel of academic architecture. He wore the same faded blue uniform, carried the same battered toolkit, and nodded to the same security guard who barely acknowledged his existence. "Morning, Frank," Marcus would say in his carefully practiced broken English. "Yeah, morning," Frank would grunt, not looking up from his newspaper. What Frank didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Marcus Demere was once Staff Sergeant Marcus Demere, 75th Ranger Regiment, with 3 tours in Afghanistan and a classified operation in Syria that officially never happened. A man who could disable an enemy combatant in 12 different ways without making a sound. But that was before the explosion in Kandahar, before the medical discharge, before the PTSD diagnosis that made him unemployable in any security capacity. Before the government that had once called him a hero decided he was a liability. So Marcus became invisible, and being invisible, he discovered, was its own kind of superpower. Professor Williams breezed past him in the hallway, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. She was heading to her 9 a.m. lecture on international security policy, where she would discuss theoretical terrorist threats to academic institutions. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. "Excuse me," she said sharply as Marcus's cart momentarily blocked her path. Sorry, Marcus mumbled, quickly moving aside with exaggerated clumsiness. She rolled her eyes and continued on, muttering something about these people. If Professor Williams had bothered to look closely, she might have noticed that Marcus's eyes weren't focused on his cleaning supplies. They were scanning the corridor, cataloguing the positions of 3 security cameras, noting the pattern of student traffic, and observing that the emergency exit alarm had been disabled for maintenance, a detail that would become crucial in exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds. Marcus pushed his cart toward the computer science building, his movements seeming random to casual observers. But his route was anything but random. Over 8 years, he had mapped every inch of this campus. He knew which doors were unlocked at what times. He knew the security rotation schedules better than the security supervisor did. He knew about Professor Chen's habit of leaving his office window open, the blind spot in the northeast stairwell, and the fact that the basement tunnels connecting 4 buildings weren't on any official blueprint. He had noticed other things too, like the way certain students had been photographing building layouts over the past month, how 3 different maintenance workers had asked unusually specific questions about the heating system. The pattern of vehicles that had been circling the campus perimeter during shift changes. Marcus had tried to report his observations. 3 months ago, he had approached campus security with his concerns, speaking in his broken English persona. "I see bad men," he had told them. "They take pictures, not students." The security chief had laughed. "Marcus, buddy, everyone takes pictures on campus. It's Harvard. Tourists, prospective students, parents. Nothing to worry about." Marcus had persisted. No, these different. Military haircuts. They watch guards." "Look, Marcus," the chief had said, not unkindly, "I appreciate you looking out for the campus. But let us handle security, okay? You just focus on keeping things clean." So Marcus had stopped reporting, but he hadn't stopped watching. This morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made his old combat instincts hum like a tuning fork. He had noticed the black SUV parked on Garden Street for the third consecutive day. He had seen the man in the Harvard sweatshirt who was definitely not a student. Marcus knew the look of a professional operator when he saw one. As he mopped the floor outside the main lecture hall, Marcus listened to the conversations flowing around him. Students complaining about midterm exams, professors discussing research grants, administrators worrying about budget cuts. Normal academic concerns that would become irrelevant in less than 5 minutes. A group of undergraduates stood nearby, clearly stressed about an upcoming presentation. "I can't believe Professor Williams is making us present on counter-terrorism," one of them groaned. "Like, what do we know about stopping terrorists?" "More than the janitor, at least," another laughed, glancing at Marcus with casual dismissal. Marcus continued mopping, but his jaw tightened slightly. If only they knew that he had spent 3 years studying terrorist tactics, infiltration methods, and campus security vulnerabilities as part of his official duties. If only they knew that he could probably teach their professor a few things about real-world threat assessment. But they would never know. And that was fine with Marcus. Anonymity was armor. His radio crackled softly, the maintenance frequency that the cleaning staff used to coordinate their work. To most ears, it was routine chatter about supply requests and schedule changes, but Marcus had modified his radio years ago to pick up additional frequencies, including campus security and local police. What he heard now made his blood run cold. "Unit 7 to command. We have eyes on the target building. Multiple entry points confirmed. Academic staff count verified. Initiating final phase." The voice was professional, calm, and definitely not campus security. Marcus casually pushed his cart toward a supply closet, his mind racing through possibilities and protocols. 8 years of preparation were about to pay off. Every security code he had memorized, every hidden passage he had discovered, every camera blind spot he had catalogued, it all led to this moment. He reached the supply closet and pulled out his phone, a device that looked like a standard flip phone but contained modifications that would have impressed his old military communications team. His fingers moved quickly across the keypad, entering a sequence that connected him to a number he had hoped never to use. The call was answered on the first ring. Ghost Protocol Emergency Line. "This is Yankee 77, requesting immediate activation of Sleeper Asset Protection Protocol," Marcus said, his broken English accent vanishing completely. "Yankee 77, we show you as discharged and inactive. Discharge was cover story. Asset has been in deep meat maintenance surveillance for 8 years. Harvard University is about to be hit by organized terror cell. Academic staff in immediate danger." There was a pause. Then, "Asset confirmed. What do you need?" "Nothing. I'm going dark. If I don't check in within 2 hours, assume Asset is compromised." Marcus ended the call and pulled off his janitor's uniform. Underneath, he wore tactical clothing that he had been carrying in his toolkit for 3 years. From the bottom of his cart, he retrieved items that appeared to be cleaning supplies but were actually disassembled weapons and equipment. A compressed air canister became a flashbang grenade. A bottle of industrial cleaner contained smoke compounds. His mop handle contained a collapsible tactical baton. The false bottom of his cart held body armor and a Glock 19 with 3 extra magazines. As he suited up, Marcus allowed himself one moment of dark satisfaction. All those professors and students who had looked through him, who had dismissed him as just the help, were about to discover what real security looked like. His radio crackled again. "All units in position. Target building secured. Begin Phase 2. Marcus checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. The 9 a.m. classes would be starting soon, which meant maximum occupancy in the lecture halls. Whoever planned this knew the university's schedule perfectly. He moved toward the main corridor, no longer the shuffling, invisible janitor. His posture was straight, his movements precise and purposeful. The transformation was so complete that several students did double takes as he passed, not quite recognizing the man they had seen every day for years. Through the main window, Marcus could see the black SUV moving closer to the building. 2 more vehicles were approaching from different directions. This wasn't a random attack. This was a coordinated operation designed to trap everyone inside while eliminating any possibility of escape or rescue. They had planned well, but they had made one crucial error. They had forgotten about the janitor. 3 months earlier, Marcus had first noticed them. It started with the man in the Harvard maintenance uniform who asked too many questions about building layouts. "Hey, buddy," the fake maintenance worker had said, approaching Marcus in the basement. "I'm new to this section. Can you show me where all the electrical panels are?" Marcus had played his role perfectly, shrugging and responding in broken English. "I just clean. No electric." But he had watched where the man went, what he photographed when he thought no one was looking. The electrical panels, yes, but also the emergency exits, the security camera positions, and the building's structural support points. The second time was during the false fire drill 2 weeks later. Marcus had noticed that 3 students didn't evacuate with everyone else. Instead, they had used the confusion to access restricted areas and measure response times. The third incident was the delivery truck that had spent too long unloading what appeared to be routine supplies. Marcus had observed the driver using professional surveillance techniques to scout the campus perimeter. Each incident alone might have been innocent. Together, they painted a picture of systematic reconnaissance, the kind conducted by people planning something much larger than a simple break-in. Marcus had tried one more time to warn campus security. He had approached Frank, the guard he saw every morning. "Frank, I think bad people watch school," he had said, maintaining his limited English act. "Marcus, come on," Frank had replied, not unsympathetically. "You watch too much TV. This is Harvard, not some action movie. They take pictures of cameras. I see them. Probably just film students or something. Look, I appreciate you looking out, but we've got it covered, okay?" Marcus had nodded and walked away, but internally he had been calculating. If campus security wouldn't listen to the janitor, then the janitor would have to handle this himself. That evening, Marcus had returned to campus after hours, something he did regularly as part of his deep cover maintenance routine. Using key cards he had acquired over the years and alarm codes he had observed, he had accessed areas where the suspicious individuals had been seen. In the computer science building, he had found evidence of digital intrusion attempts on the university's network. Someone had been mapping the internal systems, looking for vulnerabilities in everything from class schedules to emergency response protocols. In the basement of Blackstone Hall, he had discovered that someone had placed taps on the main communication lines. These weren't amateur devices. They were professional-grade surveillance equipment that could intercept everything from phone calls to internet traffic. Most disturbing of all, in the abandoned maintenance tunnel that connected to the library, Marcus had found a cache of supplies hidden behind a false wall. Radio equipment, tactical gear, and what appeared to be timer devices that could be used for coordinated attacks. The evidence was clear. Someone was planning a large-scale operation targeting the university. The question was who, and more importantly, when. Marcus had spent the next month conducting his own counter-surveillance. Using techniques from his special forces training, he had begun tracking the watchers, photographing them when possible, documenting their patterns and behaviors. The team was professional, probably former military, possibly foreign intelligence. They rotated personnel regularly, never used the same observation point twice in a row, and communicated using encrypted devices that Marcus couldn't intercept. But they had one weakness. They assumed they were invisible to campus support staff. Like most people, they looked right through the janitor. This allowed Marcus to get close enough to identify faces, vehicle license plates, and operational patterns. He discovered that they conducted their reconnaissance during the busiest parts of the day, when their presence would be masked by normal campus activity. He also realized that they had been observing the university for at least 6 months, far longer than his initial detection. This suggested a patient, well-funded operation with significant advanced planning. The breakthrough came when Marcus overheard a conversation between 2 of the watchers in the library stacks. They thought they were alone, speaking in low voices in what sounded like Arabic mixed with heavily accented English. The professor's schedule confirmed, one had said. International Security Lecture, Room 203, every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m. Student count? The other had asked. Maximum capacity, usually around 200 in the main hall, plus overflow viewing in connected classrooms. Perfect. High-value target with maximum impact. Marcus had felt ice in his veins. They weren't just planning an attack. They were specifically targeting Professor Williams' counter-terrorism class. The irony was cruel. Students learning about terrorist threats were about to become victims of one. That night, Marcus had made a decision that would have surprised his former commanding officers. Instead of immediately contacting authorities, he had chosen to continue his surveillance and gather more intelligence. His reasoning was tactical. If he exposed the operation too early, the terrorists would simply postpone and relocate. But if he waited until they were committed to their attack plan, he could stop them completely while they were most vulnerable. It was a calculated risk that went against every protocol he had ever learned. But Marcus was no longer bound by military protocols. He was operating in a grey area between his official discharge and his unofficial mission to protect the place that had become his second home. Over the following weeks, he had mapped the complete terrorist network, 12 operatives total, with equipment caches in 3 different locations on campus. Their plan was sophisticated. Simultaneous attacks on multiple buildings during peak class hours, with the main assault focused on Blackstone Hall, where Professor Williams taught her security policy course. The symbolism wasn't lost on Marcus. They wanted to turn an academic discussion about terrorism into a real-world demonstration of their capabilities. What they hadn't counted on was that one of the people they had been surveilling for months wasn't actually a victim. He was a guardian who had been preparing for this exact scenario. Now, as Marcus finished his transformation from janitor to operator, he felt the familiar calm that came with mission clarity. He had spent 8 years becoming invisible, so that he could be visible at exactly the right moment. The terrorists thought they had planned the perfect attack. They were about to discover that their perfect plan had one fatal flaw. They had forgotten about the man who cleaned up after everyone else. At 8:52 a.m., Marcus positioned himself in the maintenance corridor that ran behind the main lecture halls. Through a ventilation grate, he could see into Professor Williams's classroom, where students were settling in for her Tuesday morning lecture on counter-terrorism strategies in academic environments. The irony was almost absurd. Marcus's modified radio crackled with terrorist communications. Perimeter teams in position, building access confirmed. Target room has 187 occupants. They had been counting. This wasn't random violence. It was a precisely calculated operation designed for maximum impact and media coverage. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Professor Williams beginning her lecture. Today we'll be discussing how terrorist organizations select targets based on symbolic value and victim demographics. At that exact moment, the fire alarm system activated throughout the building. But this wasn't a drill. Marcus recognized the pattern. The alarms had been triggered manually in a specific sequence designed to confuse evacuation procedures and trap people inside certain areas. Marcus pulled up the building's emergency protocols on his modified phone. The fire alarm should have unlocked all electronic doors and activated emergency lighting. Instead, his security system showed that several key exits had been sealed remotely, and the emergency lights in critical stairwells had been disabled. The terrorists had hacked the building's safety systems, turning Harvard's own security infrastructure against itself. Through the ventilation system, Marcus could hear the confusion beginning to spread. Students and faculty were trying to evacuate, but finding themselves funneled into specific corridors where they would be easy to control. Multiple explosions reported in adjacent buildings came the voice over terrorist communications. Campus security responding as predicted. Local police dispatch delayed by coordinated traffic incidents. Marcus felt a familiar chill. This wasn't just an attack on Harvard, it was a demonstration of capability. The terrorists were showing that they could manipulate not just campus security, but municipal emergency response systems. His radio crackled again. Phase 2 initiated. Academic targets secured in main lecture hall. Proceed with media protocol. Through the ventilation grate, Marcus could see armed figures entering Professor Williams's classroom. Students screamed. Some tried to run, but the exits had been electronically sealed. They were trapped. The lead terrorist stepped to the front of the classroom, his weapon trained on Professor Williams. He spoke in clear, unaccented English. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a practical demonstration of the terrorist strategies you've been studying. Today, you won't just be learning about counter-terrorism. You'll be experiencing terrorism firsthand." Marcus counted 6 hostiles in the main classroom, with at least 3 more visible through the corridor windows. All were professionally equipped and moved with military precision. But they had made their first tactical error. They assumed they had accounted for all security personnel on campus. They knew about the campus police, the security guards, and the emergency response teams. What they didn't know about was the janitor who had been conducting his own 8-year intelligence operation. Marcus accessed the building's hidden maintenance systems through his phone. Over the years, he had discovered that Blackstone Hall contained legacy infrastructure from its original 1920s construction, systems that weren't connected to the modern digital networks the terrorists had compromised. Using manual overrides that existed only in blueprints buried deep in university archives, Marcus began systematically restoring control over the building's security systems. First, he reactivated the emergency lighting in the stairwells, giving trapped civilians a way to navigate the building. Then he began unlocking selected doors, creating escape routes that the terrorists wouldn't immediately notice. But Marcus knew that evacuation alone wouldn't be enough. The terrorists had planned for standard emergency responses. They expected campus security to evacuate civilians while waiting for SWAT teams to arrive. What they hadn't planned for was a single operator with intimate knowledge of the building and 8 years of preparation. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Professor Williams trying to reason with the terrorists. "You don't need to hurt these students. They're here to learn, not to participate in any government policy." The terrorist leader's response was chilling. "Professor Williams, your research on counter-terrorism has been used to train agents who have killed our brothers. Today, your classroom becomes our laboratory." Marcus had heard enough. It was time to move from observer to operator. He accessed the building's fire suppression system, not the automatic sprinklers, but the older manual system that could be activated from maintenance stations throughout the building. A thick cloud of suppression fog began pouring into the main corridor, reducing visibility to near zero. At the same time, Marcus triggered every fire door in the building to slam shut, compartmentalizing the space and separating the terrorist teams from each other. Through his radio, he could hear the confusion in terrorist communications. Visibility compromised in main corridor. Navigation systems non-responsive. Something's interfering with our building control. Marcus smiled grimly. They had spent months learning the building's modern systems, but they knew nothing about its historical infrastructure. Moving through the maintenance passages he had mapped over 8 years, Marcus positioned himself directly above the main lecture hall. Through ceiling access panels that weren't on any current blueprints, he could observe the entire terrorist operation from above. 6 hostiles in the main room, 3 in the corridor, 2 at the main entrance, and 1 in the building's security office monitoring communications. 12 total, exactly as his surveillance had predicted. But numbers weren't the issue. The issue was minimizing casualties while neutralizing threats. In a confined space with nearly 200 hostages, any direct confrontation could result in a massacre. Marcus needed to isolate and eliminate the terrorists one by one, without alerting the others to his presence. It required patience, precision, and the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. From his position in the ceiling, Marcus accessed the building's sound system. Using equipment he had cached years earlier, he began broadcasting a low-frequency tone that would interfere with the terrorists' radio communications without being audible to human ears. Almost immediately he heard confusion in their transmissions. "Command, we're losing radio clarity. Signal degraded." While they struggled with communications, Marcus made his first move. The terrorist in the security office was Marcus's first target. Isolated from the others, monitoring communications he could no longer clearly receive, the man was focused on his electronic equipment when Marcus dropped silently through a ceiling panel behind him. It was over in seconds. A rear-naked choke, applied with the precision that came from years of close-quarters combat training. The terrorist went unconscious without making a sound. Marcus stripped him of his radio, weapons, and identification. The ID showed a Pakistani passport with multiple entry stamps from countries known for terrorist training. But the equipment was high-end, military-grade. This wasn't an amateur operation. From the security office, Marcus could access the building's master controls. He began systematically mapping terrorist positions using the camera system, while simultaneously blocking their ability to monitor his movements. Through the cameras, he watched the chaos in Professor Williams's classroom. Students huddled together, some crying, others trying to comfort their classmates. Professor Williams stood at the front, attempting to negotiate with the terrorist leader. "Your government's foreign policy has created the conditions for this," the terrorist was saying, clearly performing for what he assumed would be a media audience. "Today, American academics will experience the fear that your military brings to our countries." Marcus felt the familiar cold anger that had sustained him through countless missions. These weren't freedom fighters or political activists. They were murderers who targeted civilians to make ideological points. Time to remind them what a real operator could do. Using the security system, Marcus isolated the 3 terrorists in the main corridor by locking the fire doors at both ends. They were now trapped in a 50-foot section of hallway with no way to communicate with their teammates and limited visibility due to the fire suppression fog. Marcus moved through the ceiling to a position directly above them. Through the acoustic tiles, he could hear their increasingly panicked conversations. "Command is not responding. Something's wrong with our equipment. The building systems are malfunctioning. This wasn't in the plan. We need to regroup with the main team." They tried the fire doors and found them sealed. One of them attempted to shoot the electronic lock, but the doors were designed to withstand exactly that kind of attack. Marcus waited until they were clustered around the door, then dropped a flashbang grenade through the ceiling tiles. The explosion in the confined space was devastating. All 3 terrorists were instantly disoriented, their night vision destroyed, their hearing impaired. Marcus dropped through the ceiling while they were still blind and confused. What followed wasn't a fair fight. It was a demonstration of why Special Forces operators train for years to handle multiple opponents simultaneously. Using the fog as cover and his superior knowledge of the building layout, Marcus eliminated all 3 terrorists without a single shot being fired. Their weapons and radio equipment joined his growing arsenal. Through his intercepted communications, Marcus could hear the growing alarm among the remaining terrorists. "Teams 2 and 3 are not responding. We may have law enforcement intervention." But there were no sirens, no helicopter noise, none of the sounds that would indicate official response. The building was still under siege, but the siege was now coming from inside. Marcus made his way to the main lecture hall, where 6 terrorists still held nearly 200 hostages. This would be the most challenging part of the operation, neutralizing multiple armed opponents in a space filled with civilians. Through his ceiling observation point, Marcus studied the terrorists' positions and behavioral patterns. The leader stood at the front of the classroom, clearly in command. 2 guards flanked the doors. 3 others moved among the hostages, keeping them controlled and watching for any signs of resistance. Marcus noticed something that the terrorists had missed. Professor Williams was subtly organizing her students. Using hand signals disguised as comforting gestures, she was positioning them away from the most dangerous areas of the room. She had recognized the tactical situation and was trying to minimize casualties. Marcus felt a grudging respect for the professor he had dismissed as a theoretical academic. But even with her help, a direct assault would result in civilian deaths. Marcus needed a different approach. He accessed the building's electrical systems, beginning a careful manipulation of the classroom's lighting and power distribution. To the terrorists, it would look like random system failures. In reality, Marcus was creating specific patterns of illumination that would give him tactical advantages while disorienting his opponents. The classroom lights began flickering in irregular patterns. Some sections went dark while others remained illuminated. The terrorists' night vision equipment couldn't compensate for the constantly changing light levels. At the same time, Marcus activated the building's PA system, broadcasting multiple, overlapping conversations from different parts of the campus. To anyone listening, it would sound like security teams were coordinating response from several directions. The terrorist leader's confidence began to crack. Change of plans. We execute the primary objective now, before law enforcement arrives. Marcus realized with horror what primary objective meant. This wasn't just a hostage situation, it was a planned massacre designed to look like a suicide bombing. The terrorists intended to kill everyone in the room and blame it on explosive devices. There was no more time for careful planning. Marcus had to act immediately. From his position in the ceiling, he could see that the terrorist leader was reaching for what appeared to be a detonator device. Whatever explosive materials they had brought into the building, they were about to use them. Marcus made a decision that went against every tactical principle he had ever learned. He dropped directly through the ceiling tiles into the middle of the classroom, landing among the hostages and terrorists simultaneously. The element of surprise was total. For a crucial 3 seconds, nobody, hostages or terrorists, understood what was happening. A man in tactical gear had literally fallen from the sky into their midst. Marcus used those 3 seconds to eliminate the terrorist leader and grab the detonator before it could be activated. What followed was the kind of close-quarters combat that civilians never see outside of movies. But this wasn't choreographed violence. It was brutal, efficient, and over quickly. The remaining 5 terrorists found themselves fighting an opponent who knew the room better than they did, who had been watching them for the past hour, and who had 8 years of accumulated local intelligence at his disposal. When the shooting stopped, 6 terrorists lay dead, and 187 students and faculty remained alive. In the aftermath, as emergency services finally arrived and students were evacuated, Marcus sat quietly in the same maintenance corridor where he had begun his operation 3 hours earlier. He had changed back into his janitor's uniform and resumed his invisible persona. Campus police, FBI agents and SWAT teams swarmed the building, trying to piece together what had happened. The official narrative would undoubtedly focus on the rapid response of law enforcement and the tragic attack that had been thwarted by professional security personnel. But Professor Williams was looking for someone specific. She found Marcus in the basement, apparently cleaning up debris from the emergency response. "It was you," she said simply. Marcus looked up from his mop, maintaining his broken English act. Sorry, Professor. No understand." "The man who fell through the ceiling," she continued. "He moved like you move. He knew the building like you know the building." Marcus returned to his cleaning, but Professor Williams didn't leave. "I've been studying counterterrorism for 15 years, she said. "I know what professional intervention looks like, and I know when someone is hiding in plain sight." Finally, Marcus stopped mopping and looked at her directly. When he spoke, his English was perfect. "Professor, sometimes the most effective security is the kind nobody notices." She nodded slowly. "How long have you been protecting us?" 8 years, ever since I started working here. "And before that?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Before that, I protected different people in different places." Professor Williams studied his face, seeing him clearly for the first time. "The government doesn't know you're here, do they?" "The government discharged me as medically unfit for security work," Marcus replied. "They were probably right, but that doesn't mean I stopped caring about security." "So you've been watching over us this whole time? Alone?" "Not alone. You helped today. You positioned your students away from the danger zones. You recognized the tactical situation and acted appropriately." Professor Williams sat down on a crate, suddenly looking exhausted. "I teach theories about terrorism. You stopped actual terrorists." "Your theories aren't wrong," Marcus said, "but theories assume that systems work as designed. In reality, systems fail. When they do, someone needs to be ready to step in. Like you did today. Like I've been doing for 8 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the morning's events. "What happens now?" Professor Williams finally asked. "Now you go back to teaching," Marcus replied, "and I go back to cleaning. But surely after today, after what you did." Marcus shook his head. "After today, nothing changes. The best security is still the kind nobody notices." Professor Williams stood to leave, then paused. "Marcus, is that even your real name?" "It's the name that matters here." She nodded and walked toward the elevator. At the last moment, she turned back. "Thank you." Marcus had already returned to his cleaning, but he nodded slightly in acknowledgement. An hour later, FBI agent Sarah Chen was interviewing students about their experience during the attack. One student, a sophomore named David Park, provided a description that would puzzle investigators for months. "There was this guy who dropped through the ceiling," David said. "He moved like he was in some kind of military unit. Professional, you know. But the weird thing was, after it was over, I could have sworn I saw the janitor walking around like nothing had happened." Agent Chen made a note. "Possible private security contractor among building staff. Investigate maintenance personnel with military backgrounds." The investigation would continue for weeks. They would never find any record of military contractors being assigned to Harvard's security detail. The building's maintenance staff would be cleared after routine background checks showed nothing more suspicious than the usual collection of immigrants and blue-collar workers trying to make a living. Marcus Demir's military service record would never be connected to the janitor who worked in Blackstone Hall. Because as far as official records were concerned, Staff Sergeant Marcus Demir had been medically discharged and disappeared into civilian life 8 years earlier. The truth was simpler and more complex than any official investigation could uncover. Sometimes the people who protect us are the ones we never see, working jobs we don't notice, watching over us with skills we don't recognize. 6 months later, campus life had returned to normal. New security measures had been implemented, academic conferences on terrorism had been held, and Professor Williams had written a well-regarded paper on the human element in institutional security. Marcus continued his morning routine, arriving at 5:30 a.m., nodding to Frank the security guard, and beginning another day of invisible protection. But there were changes. Professor Williams now acknowledged him when they passed in the hallways. A few students had started saying good morning when they saw him. And the new campus security chief had quietly instituted a policy of actually listening to concerns raised by any staff member, regardless of their position. Small changes. But in the world of security, small changes could make the difference between safety and tragedy. One morning, as Marcus was cleaning the main lecture hall, he found a note left on the podium where Professor Williams taught her counter-terrorism class. "To the guardian in the shadows, your service is noticed, even when you choose to remain invisible. Thank you for protecting our community, the students and faculty of Blackstone Hall." Marcus read the note, smiled slightly, and placed it in his toolkit next to his other tools of protection. Then he returned to work, watching over the people who would never know his true name, but who were safe because he had chosen to care for them from the shadows. Because sometimes the most important job in the world is the one nobody knows you're doing. 5 years later, a new terrorist threat emerged targeting American universities. FBI analysts studying attack patterns noticed something unusual. Every campus that had been successfully attacked shared a common characteristic. They had recently changed their maintenance staff. The campuses with stable long-term support personnel remained secure, often in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Attacks were discovered before they occurred. Suspicious individuals were reported by staff members with unusual observational skills. Security vulnerabilities were identified and corrected by people who seemed to know their buildings better than the architects who designed them. Agent Sarah Chen, now a senior investigator specializing in domestic terrorism, began to suspect a pattern. It's like these campuses have guardian angels we can't see. She was closer to the truth than she realized. Across the country, in maintenance closets and service corridors, men and women with skills that didn't match their job descriptions continued their quiet vigil. Veterans who had found purpose in protection rather than recognition. Experts who had chosen invisibility over authority. They mopped floors and fixed broken pipes and emptied trash cans. And they watched. And they remembered. And when the moment came, they acted. Because the most effective security force in America wasn't wearing uniforms or badges. They were wearing work clothes and carrying cleaning supplies, protecting people who never knew they needed protection. Marcus Demir retired from Harvard on a Thursday in spring, after 10 years of service. His replacement was a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had served 2 tours in Iraq as a combat engineer before being medically discharged with a leg injury that made her unsuitable for security work. On Elena's first day, Marcus gave her a tour of the building's hidden systems and secret passages. He showed her the cache of emergency equipment he had maintained for a decade. He explained the observation points and communication protocols that had kept Harvard safe. "How many others are there?" Elena asked. "People like us, doing this kind of work?" Marcus smiled. "More than you'd think, fewer than we need." As he walked out of Blackstone Hall for the last time, Marcus passed a group of students discussing their upcoming final exams. They were worried about grades and graduate school applications and summer internships, normal concerns of young people building their futures. None of them looked at the man in the janitor's uniform walking past them. He was invisible to them, as he had always been. But Professor Williams saw him from her office window. She watched him load his few personal belongings into an old Honda Civic and drive away from the campus he had protected for a decade. That evening, she revised the final lecture of her counterterrorism course. When she delivered it the next week, she spoke about an important truth that wasn't in any textbook. The most effective security professionals are often the ones you never notice, she told her students. They don't wear uniforms or carry badges. They don't seek recognition or praise. They simply choose to care about your safety more than their own comfort. Remember this. The person who saves your life might be someone you see every day but never really see. The janitor, the security guard, the maintenance worker, the cafeteria staff. These are often the people who know your building, your routines, your vulnerabilities better than anyone. And sometimes, just sometimes, they're the thin line between you and the people who want to hurt you. One student raised her hand. "Professor Williams, are you talking about someone specific?" Professor Williams smiled slightly and looked out the window toward the parking lot where Marcus's car had been parked every morning for 10 years. "I'm talking about all the heroes we never thank because we never know they exist." After class, she found a note on her desk, written in Marcus's careful handwriting. "Professor, thank you for seeing what others chose not to see. Keep teaching them about the real world. Some of your students might decide to protect it, a friend in the shadows." 3,000 miles away, Marcus Demir began a new job as a night security guard at a children's hospital in Oregon. The hiring manager had been impressed by his references and his willingness to work the unpopular overnight shifts. What she didn't know was that Marcus had chosen the hospital specifically because his research had identified it as a potential target for domestic terrorists opposed to certain medical procedures performed there. On his first night, Marcus walked the empty corridors, learning the layout, identifying vulnerabilities, and beginning the patient observation that had become his life's work. In his toolkit, alongside the standard security equipment, he carried tools that weren't on any official inventory. His radio was modified to pick up additional frequencies. His flashlight contained emergency medical supplies. His keyring held access cards that had taken him 6 months to acquire through careful cultivation of staff relationships. Because Marcus had learned an important truth during his years at Harvard, there would always be people who wanted to hurt the innocent, and there would always be a need for people willing to stand between them. The most important battles weren't fought on distant battlefields by soldiers in uniform. They were fought in hospitals and schools and office buildings by people in work clothes who had chosen to care. As dawn approached and Marcus completed his first shift, he sat in the hospital security office and updated his personal log, a practice he had maintained for 15 years. Day 1, building layout assessed, staff schedules documented, potential vulnerabilities identified, emergency protocols reviewed, ready to begin protection detail. He paused, then added, "Some things never change. The best way to protect people is to become someone they never notice until they need you." Outside the window, the morning shift was arriving. Doctors and nurses and administrative staff, all focused on their important work of healing and caring. None of them noticed the security guard at his desk, quietly watching over them with skills that could have taken him anywhere, but had brought him here, to this place where vulnerable people needed protection from threats they would never see coming. Because that's what guardians do. They watch, they wait, they protect, and they ask for nothing in return except the knowledge that the people they care about can sleep safely, work peacefully, and build their lives without fear. In the end, that was enough. It was everything. The Invisible Man smiled and began planning his day of watching over the people who would never know his name.